Colleen Atwood, congratulations on your Oscar nomination for Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. Having won 3 Oscars and been nominated every year, it seems, is it still a surprise when you hear that you've been nominated?
It is. It's like, you kind of forget on that day, especially if you're working. I've been working on something in the UK, and I forgot, that it was that day, and then I got the phone call, and I was like, whoa, because it was like 2 in the afternoon for me, or 3, and it's very exciting to be nominated no matter what.
Well, you've won 3 Oscars for Chicago, Memoirs of a Geisha, and Alice in Wonderland. Give us some insight into what those experiences were like.
Well, Chicago was the first time I won an Oscar, and it was great because I was on a movie that had a lot of momentum. It was very, you were part of this huge, exciting group that was going to the Oscars. To contrast that, with Geisha and Alice, it was sort of the artistic people were nominated, but some of the people that I felt should have been included weren't. So it's kind of a bittersweet feeling. You're thrilled that you're nominated, and at the same time, you're sort of sad that the people that made the movie, like the director and the producers, aren't recognized in the same way.
Right. Let's talk a bit about your nomination for Fantastic Beasts. What was, you've worked in period, you've worked in fantasy. This is sort of a bit of both. So what are some of the challenges that present to you as a costume designer when you take on a project like this?
Well, you want to do something that's in the period, but it still feels accessible to the audience, that, even though it's period, you get the mood of the period, and I used a lot of real period clothes, but luckily, the period was sort of a beautiful, with the help of the incredible sets backdrop, and then the sort of wizarding world was the period with a twist. So I was designing period, but I was putting a fantasy twist on a period as it moved into the magical world.
Right. And where do you start? Where does your work begin for you? I mean, with designing.
Well, usually it begins with a story, and you read the story and you start seeing the characters, and you see how you see the characters, and then you sort of talk to the director and the actors about their vision of the characters. And at that point, I just start looking for images, and I look everywhere. I look at all kinds of things. I look at fashion. I look at tons of period research. I look at character photographs from even spanning 20 years before and 20 years after. Just if I see a person that feels like the person that's playing the part, even though he might not be in exactly the right period, the mood of the photograph or image is sometimes, more evocative than the actual year.
All right. So on this film, what were some of your initial thoughts in terms of color and style and things like that?
Well, I had one thing that was interesting about this particular film is, it's New York at a time that was crazy and, full of life and full of all kinds of people coming to New York together. And I really wanted to get the feeling of different cultures coming together in America at that time. I mean, it had been happening for a long time in the U.S., but that time it was really evolving, and different people had really dug their roots in. So I wanted to get the feeling, and because we shot architecturally in different parts of New York, I tried to make the costumes feel like that part of New York City, say the Italian neighborhood. They had more kind of Italian-based costumes. Uptown, so let's see, the banks were, the Upper East Side, and so on and so forth. So that was a fun way to take the period and sort of dissect it. You had the new people coming into the country, settled in, like the Irish on the Upper East Side in the beginning, in Yorkville and stuff. So it was really an interesting, fun period of research.
And then filtering all that through the element of fantasy, how did that influence your work or affect it?
Well, my first kind of go-to with the fantasy, in a way, was I really liked looking at the creatures and what they were and their colors and all the character of them, because I felt, especially Newt, who came from that world the most, and who was sort of the outsider coming into New York. Um, I wanted him to feel like he was otherworldly, but still pass on the street. When you saw him walking down the street, you didn't like point your finger and go, "Who's that weird looking guy?" You didn't want that, but you wanted something special. And Eddie started developing this like curious kind of gait and this sort of way of looking at things that really helped me kind of come up with a shape for the costume. And I think that and the color of the different beasts, like a lot of more iridescent kind of colors, um, influenced the color I used on his coat, because I wanted it to pass in a group of dark coats, but also stand out a little bit.
And then working with David Yates, what was that collaboration like?
Well, David Yates is an incredibly generous collaborator all the way down the line. He treats everyone very, very with huge respect, and I think he's really well loved for it. He's a very gentle-spoken person, but very on his game. He doesn't miss anything. And, I'd come up with an idea, and he'd be very enthusiastic with ideas. And, if he wasn't sure about something, he also, he wasn't afraid to say, "Oh, I don't know, I'm not sure about that."
Right. And on a film like this, I mean, it's so immaculately designed, not just with your costumes, but with the sets and the makeup and all of that. Talk about how all of the different departments on a film like this work together to create a cohesive vision and style.
Well, when you do a movie of this scope, the production work out in so when I started to film, my first stop was the art department, which was spectacular. The research, the colors, the graphics, all those things. It was just really great to walk through that room, that research, and sort of see the architecture of the film, and knowing what I kind of previously knew from my own research, the architecture of the clothing from the period, and seeing what areas I was going to focus one kind of sort of clothing style and one another, to go with the environments that Stuart Craig and his team had created.
Right.
Hair and makeup generally starts after us, so a lot of times they take our research and apply it to their stock and their thing. So, I had boards prepared for them. I had a lot of research for them to go off of when they started, and then they did some of their own character research.
Right. And then from a practical standpoint, all after you've done all this work designing the costumes, talk about creating them and then creating multiple ones and all the nuts and bolts things that go into creating these costumes for filming.
Well, the one thing with a film like this, you have the period, and then you have special effects, you have action sequences, you have ice, you have water, you have all kinds of elements, natural elements. So you anticipate on a good day what the costume's going to have to do. And in this case, the costumes weren't changed during, it was a short span of telling. So the costumes on the main four people only changed slightly. Newt never changed clothes. Dan never changed clothes. And the ladies had their magical moment where they got to do their flapper thing, which was very exciting for all of us, just to get a different, frock on them. So it was kind of like, you had to have these clothes that persevered through the story. So when you do that, you make, say, a dozen costumes, but then you break them down at different levels. So when something happens to them, they go to another coat that's got the mud on the hem and the hole in the sleeve and all the little details that sell the action of the film.
Right. You mentioned Eddie Redmayne earlier, and how he influenced his designs. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about designing costumes for the actors that really fit their character, and from a practical standpoint, they can, you know, move around in. How does that influence your work?
Well, I start with the design first, and then I back into it and figure out a way to make it an action costume. Because there's little things I do, like put stretch in the seams. Do some of them you make a little bit bigger if they have to have a harness underneath. But you anticipate in the cut of the costume what it's going to have to do. Where, you know, you had Eddie's costume with the coat that needed to move and have that sort of elegance to it, but at the same time he had to sit in it a lot, so it couldn't be too long because it would make it awkward standing up and down. So there were things that went into his costume. Colin Farrell was a presence in his costume. You know, he was a big presence, so I did a sort of, you know, I called him the Joan Crawford shoulders, the big shoulders, sort of, you know, more kind of elegant sweep of the coat, like almost like a 18th century greatcoat. It's got kind of a lot of periods combined in his fantasy coat, but I thought it gave him heat, and that's where I was going with his character and his sort of look. While there's authority, there's also a kind of slightly sinister undertone with the darker colors and the sort of, you know, slightly wizardy kind of quality to it. And then Ezra Miller's costume is almost like a costume that I wanted it to feel like he was ready to burst out of the costume. His character was ready to mutate into this other being, this other entity. So I wanted his costume almost like a shell that sort of kind of held him together in the costume.
Right. You've worked on a wide variety of films over the last few years. Just reading off some of the films that you've been nominated for: Little Women, Beloved, Sleepy Hollow, Series of Unfortunate Events, Sweeney Todd, Nine, Into the Woods, Snow White and the Huntsman. It's a wide variety of material, and people like Tim Burton and Rob Marshall and Jonathan Demme. What has attracted you to the films that you've worked on?
Well, the thing that attracted me to all of them was their ability to tell a story visually, and to work with them all visually and creatively in developing characters in a visual sense of film made those particular film experiences.
Well, Colleen Atwood, congratulations again on your nomination, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat. It was a real pleasure.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good one.